Hello, and welcome to today's coffee talk on the importance of methodology. I'm Brent Bisking, Program Manager at PAEA for Recruitment and Engagement. I'm here with Dr. Denise Rizzolo, and I'll hand it off to her to start the webinar.
Yep. So thanks everyone for attending. Usually as we go on, we pick up with participants, so we'll be letting them in as they come along. As Brent said, I'm Denise Rizzolo. I am the editor for PAEA, the editor for JPAE, and I am the research director at PAEA. We've developed this 6-part webinar series, Finding Your Starting Point in Scholarship, really to help even seasoned faculty and new faculty get started with publication, and also to help with our grant process, because sometimes there's a lot of questions, and we've decided to break it down to more of these bite-sized portions so that it's easier to follow, and also I think that you could fit it a little bit better into your schedule. So today we have Dr. Morella Bruza. She is a research scientist for NCCPA and a past award winner for our grants. Am I correct, Dr. Bruza? And she is going to talk to us about why is methodology so important. We just ask that you put any of your questions in the Q&A. Brett and I will monitor it as we go along, and then at the end, we'll answer any questions, and we'll direct them right towards Morella. So without further ado, Morella?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Denise. I am going to share my slides. Can you guys see my slides? Let's see
All
if I
good. You
can.
just have to go.
All
Yep,
right,
you're good.
perfect. Well, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and talk to you about methods, which, surprising or not, I do like statistics, something that I did never think I was gonna like. But again, this is a really, really short presentation when I'm going to talk about different methodology, and I'm sure it's going to create more questions than answers. But I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. I'm also happy to share my email address if anybody has any questions or if they need some extra resources. And I did place some extra resources at the end of the presentation if you want to read more. So in this webinar, we're just gonna quickly talk about some methodology aspects and how they align with the research questions. So the objectives are right there. So these are a couple of things that we probably have discussed through this webinar series, and many of you may be familiar or are familiar, that's why you're joining, or you are trying to learn more information. So things that probably before we get to the method section, we need to talk about a general problem. What is something that is bothering us and we need to discover or we need to explore or learn about it? And once we have a general idea on the topic, we think about the literature review to see what's being done in the past in that specific topic. And then we can specify the problem or the question or hypothesis. And once all these 3 steps have been done, then we go to the methodology section, determining how we're going to design our research, the methods, how we're going to collect the data and analyze it. I'm not going in too many details of analyzing and collecting the data, but I do need to talk a little bit about it because it's easier to work with the methodology. So the way that I look at the method question or the method section or methodology section is like what is important in research is the process, how we do it. What is the structure or the framework that we are conducting it and how we are executing that particular research. So it's pretty much the execution of whatever problem we're trying to resolve. We're not talking too much about the presenting our results section because that's a whole different aspect of it. And at the end, we're going to summarize our finding, discussion of how those findings can help implement policy, further research, or practice. So again, we're not going to talk about the other points in here. So this is the way that I think about methodological approach. It always has to be reflected in our research question and the purpose, what, how, and in what way. Once we have a problem, we have to think about how are we describing those characteristics? Are we describing that particular problem, or are we trying to understand or gain knowledge? Or are we trying to determine a cause and effect relationships? Once we're trying to figure it out how we're going to represent that problem, then we can think about what type of data do we want. Do we want a quantitative data or a qualitative data? And just a quick overview again, and I'm going to go in details a little bit more about the type of data, but are we doing qualitative, quantitative data, or are we doing mixed methods? Other things to consider is how are we going to define our population? What tools are we choosing afterwards? Are we doing surveys? We can do surveys for both qualitative and quantitative data. Are we doing secondary data set, meaning that the data it's already collected, like PAA has a lot of data on student and faculty. The data it's already collected, it's done, and we can just access the data and then determine what we need from those variables. Are we doing interviews? Are we interviewing the participants? And again, everything is based on our research questions. So I'm going to give you a little bit of examples how. After we have determined how we're going to use the sample of the population and how we're going to collect the data, we need to have a reliable, valid, and ethical methodology so that we can represent those results ethically. And the other things we need to think about is limitations. Again, with every study, it doesn't matter how perfect it is, there are limitations and strength to the study. And we need to acknowledge that. And it's totally perfectly fine to have limitations, because it's those limitations that make us think about how we can improve our next study. So the first thing I'm going to focus is sampling quantitative research. So what quantitative data or quantitative research, which many of you already know or are familiar, is measurement of numbers. We're looking for numerical analysis of the data that either already exist, or we are creating structured survey to collect the data, or we're conducting an experiment. So in that regard, what type of sampling do we do? Do we use a random sampling of our population? Do we use a convenient sampling? Convenient sampling is, for instance, I work at X university. I want to, collect data on all my students. So that's some types of convenient sample or purposeful sampling, meaning that we purposely only wanted to view data for PA students and nobody else. And then the other thing we have to think about once we figure out what type of sampling population can answer our questions, and again, I'm going to give you examples in a minute, we have to think about the statistical power. What that means is the size of the population. For instance, the larger or the bigger the size of the population, the smaller the sampling error is. Meaning that if we have a bigger population, then we'll be able to have a better representation of the population that we're examining on that data. So I'm going to skip the qualitative for a second. So again, for the method section, when we look at quantitative research, we're looking what are we observing and what are we measuring for a particular group. So that includes number like age, income, test score. So here's a quick example because we're looking, at the sampling criteria, tools that we're going to use, and variables. So we're doing a cross-sectional study of a quantitative data. We're using, NCCPA data set. This is our population size, and this is the response rate. So we know what we're looking for. And then when we talk about variables, it has to be concrete variables. Like we're looking at age, gender, race, ethnicity, like I highlighted in here. So those are the things that we're looking for. Once we have determined the tools and the variables, then we can do statistical analysis. It can be different types of it. And again, it's a whole section about what type of analysis to choose. So I'm just giving a little bit of example, and this is just a test bite. So if you're interested, there's some resources at the end that you can read more about different things. But, things that it's called descriptive. We're summarizing what we find. What is the mean age of the population? What is the distribution based on gender, for instance? Or we can do cross-tabulation comparing one group to another. We can do inferential statistic. We can do either regression or t-test in order to compare two populations that are the same or check for a relationship between some variables and the outcome variables. Again, I'm not going into many details, but just an example of how to describe a method section. For this particular study, we're looking at descriptive and bivariate statistics. In this case, we're doing a t-test of independent of looking at two population, PAs that work in medically underserved areas and PAs that don't. So we're comparing two groups of the same population, and then we're comparing in terms of demographic, practice characteristic, and in this particular one, we're using SPSS statistical software. So other things that is not mentioned in here that we need to consider in the data, it's outliers. We have to check for outliers to make sure that the data is valid, and we have to check about missing data, meaning that what part of the data it's missing. Maybe some people did not put their age in there, and what are we doing with that missing data? How do we deal with missing data? So here's an example of a quantitative questions. And in quantitative questions, or when we're conducting quantitative research, we're trying to make the question in a way that we can determine what type of statistic and what particularly we are measuring. So actually, those are real examples from some of my students that I had before that have created the question. And this is very, very simple questions. And we sometimes need to start from simple an idea. Although I said it's unclear and vague, I'm okay with students or with us to start with something very vague and then to start defining it. So this one is, how do college students who see their provider regularly know more about health than those who do not? I mean, to me, it's very intuitive. Oh, college students see their provider. Are we talking about primary care provider? Are we talking about specialists? And what type of health are we talking about? Are we talking about immunizations? Are we talking about, blood work? So those are the things that I don't know specifically what I'm trying to measure. So when it comes to that, we can always have a discussion or look at the literature and say what things we are trying to measure. So this revised question in particular is there a difference in health maintenance education topic knowledge score between college students who have at least one annual visit with their primary care providers versus those who do not? So in this particular one, we have the population, which is college students, although we haven't defined which college students we're trying to examine. Are we looking at like all age groups? Are we looking at only a particular university? But we have determined that we're looking at college students that see a primary care provider within 12 months and those who don't. And in regards to topics, health maintenance education topics, although we haven't defined specifically what topics we're looking for, but we know it's healthcare maintenance education. So in this particular case, the way that the research question it's created, it looks like we need to do a comparison or t-test between those two populations, and then we have to list all the variables. Again, I didn't list it in here for the matter of time, but that's what we're trying to look. So in this particular one, it's just an exercise. And what it says is the original questions that came out was, do PA students feel confident about nutrition education in PA school? Is this clear or unclear? And if it is unclear, how would you revise it? And please feel free. I know Denise said we're not chatting, but it is very hard for me to just talk without chatting. So if anybody wants to just talk, maybe easier because I can't see the chat. But how would you consider revising this particular question?
Hello, this is Adrienne Bannon. Can you hear me?
Hi, Adrian. Yes.
I think that it's a great start, but maybe we could add in a few more details, like maybe what year are the PA students or how are they
Absolutely.
being educated and how will we measure what
Yep.
tool and how are we going to measure something like that?
Fantastic. Yep, that's a really good point, Adrian.
Thank you.
So here is another again, we can refine it and make it better, but here is a way I would suggest to kind of improve it. To what extent do PA students report confidence in their nutrition education received during PA school, as measured by a standardized validated scale? And this gives us more information because we are measuring the confidence, meaning that we're going to have some type of scale to measure that confidence. And then we're looking, do we need to look at any particular year, first year, second year? Those are variables that we need to determine. And then because we're looking about a measured standard scale, are we looking about coursework specifically? Are we looking at topics or hours? So those are some type of things that we can think more about. So this is a way to refine our question in a way that we can figure it out how to develop a methodology that we can answer, or method or statistical work that we can answer what we need to answer. And sometimes, because things are also in my head and I already know what I'm thinking about, I sometimes ask my colleagues, be like, can you please read this and make sure it makes sense? And when it doesn't make sense, that means that it's all in my head and I'm not making sense how I'm defining this question to answer X, Y, and Z. Sometimes talking with your colleagues or with somebody with more experience, I always do that because it helps me understand that is my question refined or it's not. Okay, so qualitative. Qualitative research is completely different. It actually, the purpose of qualitative research is to understand the social world and how it's perceived on a person or a particular viewpoint. It goes with observation, it goes with also interviews. We think about purposeful sampling and convenient sampling. And this particular one, when we do qualitative research, we do not need to have a large population. Sometimes just having a very defined sample, like I only want to interview or know the perspective of PA educators that work in New York. So that means I don't need to interview all the PA educators that work in New York. I can interview 20 people or 15 people. And if I get enough information and I hear the same theme or voice from all of them, that at this point I can say that I've reached the data saturation, that I don't need to interview 150 people at that point. So what's about the qualitative research is that we need to ask open-ended questions like what, how, and in what way. An example of that is this question here. How do college students perceive their institution's ability to address ABC in their campus? So we're looking about their point of view, their feeling, their perception. So with this, things do not need to be defined. We don't have specifically need to define certain things. However, what we need to define is what perception are we looking for and what population. I'm not going to go into many details in regards to the types of it, but we can do narrative qualitative research, meaning that it can come from the perception of the college students or in the individuals. Phenomenological means that it's coming from a phenomena. We're looking at a particular view, which I have an example. We can do observation. We're just observing people and seeing how they're reacting. We can do interviews. We can do reflection memos or papers in that regard and see how they view their viewpoints. And with that, it's mostly coding. So we're looking at those answers that the particular participants are answering, and then we're seeing the themes that come from that. Is everybody talking about the same theme, or are there some exception to that? I know this is a little bit hard to visualize. But what we're trying to do is trying to capture their voice and experiences in order to understand the world around. And what's good about qualitative research is because it can answer those individualized questions that we always want to answer, but we can't because the quantitative it's set and the qualitative we have more of an option. So here is a question here about qualitative that's a little bit vague. Why do women of colors do internship in computer science? Okay, so here we know we're measuring women of colors that do internship, but how do we determine the why? Is there a particular thing that we're trying to figure it out? So when we construct the question, we can make it a little bit more here. How and in what way do women of colors decide to pursue an internship in computer science? We're looking at their personal, educational, and social factors. Again, we don't have to define the specific variable for education or social factors. We just have to have a general idea. And based on the general idea, and after we've done our literature review, we can construct our questions. So the questions usually are pretty broad, and it's not a yes or no questions. Other ways we can do it in this way. I have two options. I can do narrative by interviewing the women of colors that are doing this internship and see how they're viewing the reasons why they're doing the internship, or I can do a phenomenological study. I can focus on exploring and describing the participants' lived experiences and motivations and the process. So I can go either way depending what I want to do with that. So that's a little bit about qualitative. I know it's not very straightforward. Pitfalls, again, this is a very, very short list. But when it comes to barriers in research or pitfalls that you can see in research, we're talking about for quantitative, inadequate population size. When you have a small population size, you're not able to standardize it, and we're not able to get those results that we want to. And sometimes those results cannot determine cause or effect. Sometimes if we have vague or poor defined variables can be an issue. And sometimes when we're interpreting the data, we're not thinking about things that can be a confounders, meaning that one variable can affect another variable. That's why we're getting those results. So we always have to think about confounder variables. Misinterpreting the data, sometimes we can misinterpret the data if we have not looked at the bigger picture. So the best things on those situations is to build a team of research that has experience. We don't always have to be an expert in one thing, but maybe if somebody in your team has expertise in quantitative research, you definitely want them in your team because they can point out the things that we don't know and they can help you build a stronger study. For qualitative, what's interesting about qualitative study, which I really like, is because we have to write in our research about our research biases and about our subjectivity. So I remember doing qualitative research and I had to sit, and I'm not a qualitative person, I'm more of a quantitative, I need to see the numbers, but I had to sit and reflect about a specific research I was doing and think about my bias and how the way that I was immersed in that study, how or I interpreted the study based on my point of view. So that can become tricky. So the researcher that is conducting that particular research needs to think about their own biases and how they're interpreting the study, because it's a view of somebody else that is giving that information, and you can be skewed as a researcher. So I remember writing, everything that I thought about that could potentially affect the way I would interpret the information. And typically, at least when I've conducted qualitative research, I've tried to do standardized questions, that I was asking similar questions to every single person that I interview, so that I can have standardization. Because if you don't have a standardization of that particular question, or even though we call them unstructured interview questions, they do have some structure because you're trying to get particular information out of it. You're still trying to get out specific themes. Time and resources, it takes a lot of time to do qualitative. Although the interview may be 20 minutes, it may take us 3 hours to, write all those transcripts and then interpret the transcript, code it. So we always have to think about how much time we can put on it. What are the people that are valuable? What are the resources we can use? So that's a little bit in a nutshell about qualitative and quantitative data. Those are some of the references that may be useful, and I'm happy to answer any questions.